Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you all about miniature painting and painting miniatures and everything. Yes. This is part 33, Elf Flesh, or just really pale flesh. So today we're going to be painting up this Retribution of Syra elf guy with some very pale skin tones. So obviously I started by priming it white. If you're going to be painting light colors, prime white. That makes sense. Paint light, prime white. Now in the previous skin tutorial, we used these four colors: Rat Skin Flesh, Beskor Flesh, Rakelin Flesh Shade, and Ungor Flesh. We're going to modify this palette for a lighter skin tone. So now we're going to use Beskor Flesh as our primary color, Ungor Flesh is our first highlight, then Rakelin Flesh Shade as a shade, then once again a Ungor Flesh, followed by a 1-to-1 mix of Ungor Flesh and Screaming Skull, followed by Eldar Flesh. So we're going to go up to much lighter skin tones on this particular model. So we're going to start off with Beskor Flesh, and we're going to do the same thing we did last time. We're going to thin it down, make sure we get a nice thin consistency, so that way we can get it to go on very nicely, because we're going to use a lot of layers for this tutorial to get a nice light skin tone. So we're going to thin it down. The key is when you're doing multiple thin layers, you got to thin it down, because otherwise it will obscure the details, and you don't want to do that. You want to keep those nice details and build up a nice gradual color scheme on your skin. And the reason why I painted up the cloth was just to show some contrast. I didn't want it to be an entirely white model, because then it'd be hard to see the skin tones. So I decided just to paint the cloth. Usually I paint the cloth after the skin. So as you can see here, I just nicely and gently applied the Beskor Flesh to the model and made sure I get a nice, great foundation. If there were any missing areas of paint after it dried, I applied a second quick layer. But as I said, the goal of this tutorial is to go to a lighter skin tone using a similar palette than the other skin tone, which I was just normal Caucasian skin tone. So once again, just putting in all the skin areas. And I'm using a relatively fine brush. So the goal of the Beskor Flesh is to provide the foundation of our nice skin tone. But we are going to go over it with one more color before proceeding to the shade, because that way we don't want too dark of recesses for the shading. We want a very nice subtle recess. And here's what the model looked like after it was completely dry. As you can see, I made sure that it's a nice consistent tone over all the skin tones. And now that's done, it's time to take the next one, Ungor Flesh, the next layer skin tone from the Citadel range, and apply it to the model. And I'm going to apply it to the entire surface, not leaving the recesses or anything. I'm just going to apply it to the entire recess nicely and quickly. And once again, if you find it's a little too thick, thin it down with some thinner or some medium. That way, when you apply multiple layers of paint, you're not obscuring any details. As you see, your Ungor Flesh is a considerably lighter color, which is great, because now this will go over the previous flesh tone really easily, and this will essentially provide the next layer of foundation for our skin tones. We want a very light, elvish, or just pale color scheme. And this tends to go on pretty quickly, because now we have the nice foundation, and I went on with just a simple single coat. And now it's time to apply the shade, but the Rakelin Flesh Shade is a very strong shade if you're applying it to flesh. It provides really dark, deep recesses, and I don't really like that when I'm going to a pale color scheme or a pale skin tone. So we're going to do this, once again, thin it down. So I'm going to add a little bit to my palette, and then I'm going to add about 2 to 3 parts water for every part flesh shade. That way it's diluted to about a third or a quarter to about its initial strength. And this is good, because even when it's thinned down greatly, you'll see how strong of a tone it actually produces on the miniature. And so I just very gently applied it to the surface of the skin, allowing it to get in the recesses and the crevices, but I didn't want to build up too much on the raised areas, because I wanted to keep them as little tint as possible on those areas. That way it's easier to build up the lighter tones on top of them. But as you can see, I thinned this down to about a quarter of its initial strength, And over this pale skin tone, it really does show very easily. And the goal is you don't want to make it too orangey or anything, so just apply a little bit over the skin tone. Remember, these shades will dry even darker than when you apply them, so if you're unhappy with the shading after a single tone, feel free to apply a second shading. Just let the first one dry entirely before proceeding to the second step. That's nice. Even at this point, the skin tone is almost lighter than our previous Caucasian skin tone, but we still have several more layers to build up. And here's what it looked like when it was dry. As you can see now, there's detail in the recesses, but the goal is now to build up more layers over the other areas of the model. So next we're going to take Ungor Flesh again, the same tone that we used for the second step, and we're going to apply it. I almost basically just in a quick overbrush. I applied it to all the areas that were raised and leaving the recesses the very nice Reikland Flesh shade. So I basically just dragged my brush over the model, and just built up a nice gradient of colors that way. So once again, as I said, the recesses will all be the Reikland Flesh shade plus Ungor Flesh, but now the raised areas will be just Ungor Flesh, and that's great. We want very subtle recesses when painting a pale skin tone. And here's what it looked like after it was dry. So now as you see, it's starting to build up some tones, but it's getting pretty light, and we want to keep even going further and make it lighter and lighter. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a 1-to-1 mix of Ungor Flesh and Screaming Skull. So I simply took some Screaming Skull and added it into the palette with the Ungor Flesh. And afterwards I did thin it down a little bit with some more thinner because I noticed it was a little too thick. But this is good. Basically, Ungor Flesh is a pretty light skin tone, but adding Screaming Skull, I wouldn't add white because white would make it look a little chalky and also really unbalance the tones in the skin tone. So I added an off-white. So the latest off-white the Citadel range is Screaming Skull. And once again, I just focused on the higher raised areas, trying to build up a gradual skin tone. So this, you see the top of the head, the top of the ears, the nose, the cheekbones, the hands, the top part of the arm, leaving some of the arm just the original Ungor Flesh. So now we're just trying to build up a nice gradual skin tone going from dark to light. And luckily with these skin tones, they tend to blend quite easily, I find. So they tend to go together quite nicely. And finally, when that was done, I did an Eldar Flesh dry brush. Eldar Flesh is one of the cool dry paints from the Citadel range where it basically has very, very little medium, tons of pigment, and I just did a very, very light dry brush over the surface of the face and the arms and the hands. Basically, the goal is to pick up the tops of the ears, tops of the forehead, the eyebrows, the cheeks, the nose, but a very, very light dry brush over these surfaces. That way you don't just overwhelm the surface with Eldar Flesh. I wanted to, once again, build up a very nice pale skin tone over the model. This is great. I'll pick up on all those raised areas and leave all the recesses the darker tones, as well as produce a little slightly dusted appearance on the skin, which looks really good on pale skin tones. And that's it. So here's what the model looks like with the light under it. As you can see, it's quite pale. It's considerably more pale than the Caucasian skin tone we did in the previous Miniature Painting 101 part on skin. And it turned out really well. All I did was add 2 more paints into the scheme, removed 1, so it's not that huge of a difference, but you can see the considerable difference when you start off with a light primer, you thin down your paints, and you blend your skin tones quite nicely. And here for comparison, you can see on the left is our original Caucasian skin tone, and on the right is our new Elf Flesh or pale skin tone. As you can see, it's considerably lighter than the previous one, and that is what we were going for today, but both of them will look great on the tabletop, and that's it. So thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101, and stay tuned for part 34, which is just around the corner. But if you can't wait for next week, go check out The Warp. Click on the link below for a free 14-day trial to my premium YouTube channel, where not only will you get to see the next 6 months worth of Miniature Painting 101 episodes, you also get to see start to finish painting tutorials, more battle reports, and just some awesome wargaming content. So thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101. Until next time, this is Jay saying go check out The Warp, and happy painting, everyone.